The sun rose over the battered ridges of Bataan, cutting through the haze of smoke from weeks of artillery fire. Along the dusty roads near Mariveles, tens of thousands of gaunt, exhausted men stacked their rifles into piles. Some collapsed onto the dirt, too weak to even stand at attention. After 3 months of grueling siege, their food supplies exhausted, ammunition dwindled to single rounds, and malaria running rampant, Major General Edward King Jr. surrendered the battered US and Filipino forces to Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army. It was the largest capitulation in American military history. What followed was not a march in the traditional military sense. It was a procession of human wreckage. Official US Army records estimated that 76,000 men laid down their arms that morning. Approximately 12,000 Americans and 64,000 Filipinos. These were not fresh troops. They were already weakened by months of half rations, rice gruel and whatever carabao or monkey meat could be scrounged from the jungle. Medical officers recorded average weight losses of 20 to 30 pounds before the surrender itself. Malaria, dysentery and dengue fever were endemic. Quinine and atabrine were virtually gone by March. To the Japanese captors, these starving men were not warriors. They were a disgrace. In the words of one Japanese officer, recorded in post-war interrogation by Allied translator and interpreter Section, ATIS, the American soldier had thrown down his rifle and begged for life. A man who surrenders is beneath contempt. The contempt came not merely from cruelty, but from ideology. Japanese officers had been steeped in the bushidō-infused culture of the imperial army. Surrender was dishonor, weakness was contemptible, and mercy was seen as wasteful. A captured Japanese guard's diary, found near San Fernando in 1945, described his disgust. "These Americans are fat men grown thin. They whine for water. In Nippon, a soldier dies before begging." Thus, before the march even began, the framework for brutality was set. To the guards, the prisoners were not fellow combatants bound by international convention. They were cowards who had forfeited dignity. By the afternoon of April 10th, long columns began moving north. Prisoners were ordered to walk from Mariveles to San Fernando, a distance of nearly 65 miles under the sweltering Philippine sun. The average daily temperature exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. Eyewitness Sergeant James Bolton, later debriefed by the US Army, recalled, "We had no water bottles. We passed wells, clear with fresh water, but each time we were beaten back by rifle butts or bayonets. A man bent down to drink. He was shot in the head before he could swallow. We marched past his body. From the first mile, men collapsed. Guards, impatient with the slow pace, struck stragglers with bamboo poles or executed them with quick thrusts of the bayonet. Medical analysis conducted after liberation confirmed how fragile the men already were. Typical US soldiers in the Philippines had entered service at 160 to 180 pounds. By April 1942, many weighed 120 to 130. Filipino soldiers, often smaller to begin with, were reduced to skeletal frames. Dr. Henry St. Denis, a captured army physician, noted in his post-war testimony, "These were men who had been living on 800 calories a day for 3 months, walking 60 miles in the tropics with no water. Their bodies were already on the edge of collapse. The march pushed them over it. Survivors' accounts all repeat the same image: roads lined with corpses. Private First Class Ramon Gamboa, a Filipino infantryman, remembered. At first the column was long, unbroken. By the second day, men lay beside the road, too weak to rise. They were kicked, struck, left behind. The smell of death came quick in the heat." US intelligence reports after the war estimated between 7,000 and 10,000 men died during the march itself, roughly 1 of every 10. Filipino survivors claimed the number was even higher, as entire groups of their countrymen were executed or disappeared into roadside ravines. The guards were not uniform in their cruelty. Some, especially older reservists, occasionally looked away when Filipinos slipped fruit or coconuts into the column. Others shared sips of water in secret. But most were young conscripts of the imperial army, hardened by indoctrination and fear. An interrogation of former Japanese Corporal Hideo Watanabe in 1946 revealed the psychology. "We were told the prisoners were not men. They were animals. If they were slow, we must drive them. If they resisted, we must kill them." To allow weakness was weakness itself. That doctrine translated into thousands of summary killings along the roadside. By the time the remnants reached San Fernando, many had been marching for 6 days. Eyewitnesses described a rail yard overflowing with human wreckage. Prisoners collapsed into open fields, covered in dust and excrement. From there, they were crammed into boxcars, 100 men to each car designed for 30. Temperatures inside reached lethal levels. Men suffocated standing up, their bodies unable to fall. Lieutenant Colonel William Dias, who later escaped, recalled in his 1943 report, "The stench was beyond description. We rode 70 miles packed in steel ovens. When the doors opened at Capas, bodies fell like kindling onto the tracks. From Capas, the survivors staggered the last miles on foot to Camp O'Donnell. The gates of O'Donnell represented not relief, but the beginning of systematic starvation. In the first month alone, more than 1,500 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos died of disease, dehydration, and exhaustion." Japanese records, captured after the war, revealed the guards' astonishment. A sergeant wrote in May 1942, "These prisoners fall like leaves. They are light, as if hollow. Many weigh less than children." It was the first time Japanese soldiers saw grown men, Marines, tankers, infantrymen, weighing under 100 pounds. Yet instead of inspiring mercy, it fed contempt. In later years, both American and Filipino survivors described the march as the crucible that defined captivity. Malnutrition, humiliation, and the sheer attrition of bodies along the road reduced entire regiments to skeletons before they had even reached the camps. In the words of Corporal Harold R. Brown, interviewed at the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion, "We began the march soldiers. We arrived at the camp's shadows. I weighed 160 pounds when Bataan fell. At Camp O'Donnell I was 102, and that was just the beginning." The Bataan Death March was not merely a forced transfer. It was the overture to years of starvation captivity. Guards who once viewed prisoners with disdain would, by 1945, be forced to confront men whose weight had dropped below 100 pounds, a spectacle that shocked even the indoctrinated. But in April 1942, the seeds of that horror were sown on the roads of Luzon, as 76,000 men began the walk that would define the brutality of the Pacific War. When the survivors of the Bataan Death March staggered through the gates of Camp O'Donnell, they believed the ordeal might finally be over. The reality was that the march had only been the prelude. For many, the true sentence was about to begin. Camp O'Donnell was a former training base of the Philippine Army, a cluster of wooden barracks, open fields, and barbed wire strung hastily around its perimeter. Designed to hold a few thousand men, it was suddenly crammed with over 60,000 Filipino prisoners and approximately 9,000 Americans. The infrastructure collapsed immediately. Latrines overflowed within days. Water came from a single spigot, often surrounded by hundreds of men waiting in line for hours under the tropical sun. Food rations were scarcely more than a handful of rice per man, once or twice daily. Lieutenant Ben Steele, later an artist whose sketches of captivity became iconic, remembered, "The camp was not prepared to hold that many bodies. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, coughing, moaning, too weak to swat the flies. Every morning the dead wagons rolled. By afternoon the stench was everywhere." Unlike the chaos of the march, Camp O'Donnell's horrors were systemic. Rations were deliberately cut. Where a healthy soldier required 3,000 calories per day, prisoners received barely 700 to 900 calories. Medical supplies were non-existent. An army doctor, Captain Ernest Miller, recorded in a secret notebook, "We tried to treat dysentery with water. We tried to treat malaria with hope. Men wasted away before our eyes." By June, it was common to see bodies with every rib visible, bellies bloated, legs swollen with beriberi. The Japanese garrison commander, Colonel Mori, insisted the deaths were a matter of prisoner weakness, not neglect. In an April 1946 war crimes tribunal, witnesses recalled him saying, "They are dying because they are soft. In Japan, men endure. In the Philippines, they rot." Mortality rates at O'Donnell were staggering. U.S. Army medical surveys after liberation determined that, on average, 400 to 500 men died every day in May 1942. By the time the camp was closed in June and most American prisoners were transferred to Cabanatuan, more than 1,500 Americans and 20,000 Filipinos had perished, all within the span of just 2 months. Survivor Manuel de la Cruz testified in 1945, "We had no graves, just trenches. Each morning carts came, piled with bodies. The corpses were thrown in, one atop the other, without ceremony. The ground was so shallow the smell seeped through. Malnutrition was the baseline condition. Disease finished the work. Dysentery ravaged the camp, carried by contaminated water and swarms of flies. Malaria and dengue fever thrived in stagnant pools around the barracks. Pneumonia cut down those already weakened to skin and bone." Corporal Robert Taylor, who survived until liberation in 1945, wrote in his diary, "We no longer asked who would die. We asked who would live. If a man lay down in the morning, by evening he was gone. The hospital was a bamboo hut with no medicine, only moans. The doctors tore their own shirts for bandages. As at the march, Japanese guards varied in cruelty. Some struck prisoners mercilessly for failing to stand at roll call. Others ignored the sick entirely, letting them rot in the barracks. A small minority showed pity, though rarely." Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, captured after the war, admitted, "We were ordered not to waste medicine on prisoners. We were told they would die anyway. Sometimes I gave a sick man my rice, but this was rare because if discovered, I too would be punished." The overwhelming policy was neglect, indifference weaponized into extermination. In June 1942, Japanese command finally ordered the transfer of American prisoners to a new facility at Cabanatuan, about 30 miles away. Conditions there remained brutal, but the death rate slowed somewhat with better water and more space. For the Filipino prisoners, however, O'Donnell remained their graveyard. Unlike the Americans, most were never transferred. By the end of 1942, the Filipino contingent had been reduced by more than half. Eyewitnesses consistently remarked on the transformation of men under starvation. Once proud officers became shadows, too weak to command. Young privates withered into skeletons within weeks. Sergeant Domingo Santiago later told his son, "We stopped being soldiers. We were only stomachs, begging for food. We could not think of home. We thought only of rice." The Japanese exploited this collapse. Roll calls were drawn out for hours in the sun. Prisoners were beaten for not standing straight, though many could no longer stand at all. The suffering became ritualized, an erosion of dignity as deliberate as the cutting of rations. And yet, in rare moments, the prisoners clung to defiance. They whispered songs, they traded stories of home. A handful of Filipino priests risked beatings to deliver last rites over mass graves. Lieutenant Steele recalled one evening, "We sat in the dust as the sun fell, and a Filipino boy sang in Tagalog. The guards did not understand the words, but we did. It was about the river at home. For a moment we were men again." Historians would later argue that Camp O'Donnell represented a calculated indifference, not an organized extermination camp in the European sense, but a place where neglect achieved the same outcome. The Japanese lacked resources, but more critically, they lacked will to keep prisoners alive. In the words of historian Donald Knox, writing in Death March, The Survivors of Bataan, O'Donnell was not built to kill, but it killed by default. For every man who survived, 2 did not. The camp became less a prison than a cemetery with a fence. When the war ended, survivors returned weighing less than half their pre-war mass. Many bore lifelong illnesses from starvation and malaria. Yet they remembered O'Donnell not only as a site of horror, but as the place where endurance became identity. Private Ramon Gamboa, who had endured both the march and the camp, told his grandchildren in 1970, "If I lived, it was because the man beside me gave me half his rice." At O'Donnell, we learned, no one survived alone. By the end of June 1942, O'Donnell had claimed tens of thousands of lives and set the pattern for captivity in the Philippines: deliberate malnutrition, unchecked disease, psychological humiliation. Those who survived it carried scars that defined them long after liberation. But the ordeal was not static. With the transfer to Cabanatuan, the next chapter of captivity began, a new camp where survival depended on cunning, smuggling, and the fragile lifeline of outside aid. For the men who survived O'Donnell and were transferred to Cabanatuan, hope flickered briefly. The camp was larger, better organized, and less immediately lethal than the graveyard they had just left. Yet as weeks became months, it became clear that survival here required as much cunning and endurance as any battle. Cabanatuan was divided into 3 compounds. Compound number 1 held the bulk of American prisoners, around 8,000 men at its height. Compounds 2 and 3 contained mostly Filipino soldiers, many still ravaged by disease. The physical environment was less suffocating than O'Donnell. The camp was spread out, with bamboo barracks and open fields, and water was more readily available. But the rules had not changed. The Japanese guards maintained absolute control, and food remained scarce. A small tin of rice, sometimes accompanied by a thin soup made from camote vines or papaya leaves. For a man who had once weighed 170 pounds, the daily ration barely maintained life. By late 1942, camp records and survivor accounts confirm the average prisoner weighed between 95 and 115 pounds. The Japanese viewed POWs as a labour force, not as men entitled to rest or medical recovery. Prisoners were sent out daily in labour details to repair roads, dig irrigation ditches, haul timber, and work on airstrips. The heat of Luzon, often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, made the work gruelling. Men fainted under the sun, only to be struck by guards until they rose again. Private Harold Hale later wrote, "We dug ditches from dawn to dusk. Our tools were bamboo sticks, our bodies bent double. A man who faltered was beaten with rifle butts. I watched one friend collapse and never rise again. His body was carted off like a sack of rice." By 1943, work details extended outside the camp, including to Nichols Field near Manila, where men constructed runways for Japanese bombers. Nichols would become notorious. One survivor called it a death sentence in slow motion. The punishments at Cabanatuan were systematic, designed not only to enforce obedience, but to break spirit. One method was the sun treatment. Prisoners were forced to kneel on gravel or hot earth, arms raised overhead, for hours under the tropical sun. Men collapsed, their skin blistering, their arms trembling uncontrollably. Those who fell were beaten until they resumed the posture. Another was standing at attention. Entire squads were made to stand motionless for hours, even when mosquitoes swarmed and men fainted from weakness. Survivor Sergeant Richard Moyer described a day-long ordeal. "We were made to stand until our knees buckled. When one man fell, he was kicked in the ribs. Another was dragged to the fence and beaten with a bamboo pole. At the end, half of us were carried back to the barracks. Though Cabanatuan offered more space, Disease was relentless. Malaria remained endemic. Beriberi and pellagra, caused by vitamin deficiencies, ravaged bodies. Prison doctors estimated 80% of prisoners had some form of deficiency disease by early 1943. An underground infirmary emerged, staffed by US Army and Navy doctors who had themselves been captured. Without supplies, they improvised treatments. Quinine was smuggled in by Filipino civilians. Wounds were treated with coconut husks. Water was boiled in makeshift bamboo containers. Captain James Gillespie, a camp physician, later testified, "We begged the Japanese for medicine. They refused. What little quinine we had, we rationed to the worst cases. We felt like men standing on a beach, trying to hold back the tide with bare hands." Amid deprivation, the prisoners organized systems of survival. Filipino civilians risked their lives smuggling food through the fences. Eggs, bananas, even stolen chickens. Cigarettes became currency, traded for food or favors. Small vegetable gardens were cultivated in secret behind barracks. Prisoners grew squash, beans, and sweet potatoes. Though guards sometimes confiscated crops, these gardens saved lives. There were also networks of care. Stronger men shared rice with the sick. Chaplains held clandestine services, offering words of endurance. Prisoners created makeshift scales from bamboo and stones to track their weight, though the results were often demoralizing. Lieutenant John White recalled, "We weighed ourselves one evening. I had been 175 pounds at capture. The scale showed 108. The man beside me weighed 96. We laughed, because if we did not laugh, we would weep." Japanese guards at Cabanatuan were a mixture of regular soldiers, Korean conscripts, and a few civilians. Some were brutal, others indifferent. Survivors remembered one corporal nicknamed the Buzzard, who delighted in beating men too weak to work. Another guard, called the Weasel, forced prisoners to carry heavy logs for amusement. Yet there were occasional acts of quiet leniency. One Filipino remembered a guard who allowed him to drink from a hidden well during a labour march, risking discipline from superiors. These moments, though rare, became points of whispered hope. Still, the prevailing ethos was contempt. To the Japanese military indoctrinated in bushidō, surrender was dishonour. Prisoners who lived on meagre rations, stumbling like skeletons, seemed less than men. Unlike O'Donnell, where men died in droves, Cabanatuan's death toll was slower but relentless. An average of 20 to 30 prisoners died per day in 1942 to 43. The camp's cemetery grew steadily, a field of wooden crosses rising beyond the fence. Prisoners kept mental calendars, carving notches on bamboo or scratching dates in the dirt. They marked the passing of weeks, months, years, with no certainty of survival. Sergeant Frank Caldwell later said, "At first we prayed for rescue. Then we prayed for food. Then we prayed only to wake up the next morning. Each prayer was smaller than the last, but it kept us alive." Despite starvation and punishment, prisoners resisted in subtle ways. They sabotaged tools, slowed their labour, and shared information secretly passed by Filipino civilians about the progress of the war. Rumours spread. The Americans had landed in Guadalcanal. The Japanese were losing ships. MacArthur had sworn to return. These whispers gave meaning to suffering. One survivor put it simply, "Every rumour was a meal. It gave us strength when rice did not." By late 1943, thousands had perished at Cabanatuan, yet thousands endured. They had adapted to starvation, forged networks of survival, and clung to the hope that outside the fences the tide of war was shifting. For the Japanese guards, Cabanatuan was a post of duty. For the prisoners, it was a crucible. The men who emerged from its barracks were shadows of their former selves, weighing scarcely 100 pounds, yet carrying within them a will not yet extinguished. The war was changing. American submarines now prowled Philippine waters, strangling Japanese supply lines. For the prisoners, scarcity would deepen. For the guards, desperation would grow. And in that pressure, the fragile balance of camp life would soon collapse into new extremes of hunger, brutality, and fear. The war outside the bamboo fences was shifting. In the Solomon Islands, on New Guinea, and across the Central Pacific, the Allies were advancing. The Japanese Empire, which had expanded with shocking speed in 1941 to 42, was beginning to crack. To the prisoners in the Philippines, this shift was invisible but not unfelt. The collapse of Japan's supply lines meant that even their captors now faced scarcity. And when rations thinned for the guards, they shrank to starvation for the men behind barbed wire. By late 1943, US submarines prowled the waters around Luzon. For the Japanese, shipping lanes that had once carried rice, medicines, and reinforcements now became killing zones. Merchant convoys fell victim to torpedoes, oil reserves dwindled, and local garrisons were increasingly left to live off what they could scavenge. The effects rippled inward to the camps. At Cabanatuan, records show rice rations cut by nearly a third in late 1943. The already meagre vegetable stews became thinner, often nothing more than hot water flavoured with a few kamote leaves. Meat, rare before, vanished almost entirely. A Japanese diary captured after the war put it bluntly. "There is nothing to give them. We too are hungry. They will die anyway." The physical toll was unmistakable. Prisoners' average weight dropped further, with many sinking below 100 pounds. Men who had once been athletes, farmers, and machinists became skin stretched over bone. Photographs taken after liberation in 1945, preserved in the US National Archives, show men with hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and ribs that seemed about to tear through flesh. Yet these images only confirmed what guards had been seeing daily since 1944. Sergeant John Cook wrote in his diary, "We are no longer men, only scarecrows. I weighed myself on the bamboo scale, 97 pounds, others are less, some under 90. It is strange to look at a friend and not recognize him. Scarcity gnawed at both sides of the fence. Japanese guards, many of them conscripts from rural Japan or Korea, received reduced rations themselves. Some were gaunt, uniforms hanging loose on their frames. But the imbalance remained. Guards always ate first. If food ran short, it was the prisoners who paid. A captured Japanese corporal testified in 1946. When supplies fell, the policy was to feed the garrison. Prisoners were not considered necessary. If they lived, good. If they died, also good. One less mouth. The consequence was not only starvation, but resentment. Guards who once treated prisoners with aloof contempt now often lashed out violently, their frustrations turned into punishment. Within the barracks, survival became an act of cunning. Prisoners stole scraps from garbage pits, caught stray dogs or cats, and even boiled weeds to make a bitter broth. A handful of prisoners risked venturing near the fences to exchange trinkets with sympathetic Filipino civilians who passed food through hidden gaps. One survivor recalled smuggling a handful of bananas into the barracks. "We cut them into 30 slices, one for each man. The taste of that slice, it was like heaven. It kept us alive for another week." But theft was dangerous. A prisoner caught stealing rice from the Japanese storehouse was executed before the assembled camp as a warning. Mortality rose again. Though not as catastrophic as O'Donnell, Cabanatuan averaged 2 to 3 dozen deaths per week by late 1943. The cemetery outside the camp fence expanded steadily, each bamboo cross marking another life consumed by malnutrition and disease. The camp doctors recorded causes with grim repetition: dysentery, malaria, pellagra, beriberi. Yet behind each clinical note lay a skeleton who had once been a soldier, a farmer, or a clerk. Private Walter Davis, in a letter he later dictated after liberation, described the funerals. "We dug shallow graves, sometimes 4 men to a hole. We had no prayers left, just the sound of earth on wood. Sometimes I could not tell which of us was alive, which was dead. Starvation altered not only bodies but minds. Prisoners grew irritable, prone to despair. Men obsessed over food, dreaming of steaks, bread, or milkshakes. In conversation, rations replaced strategy or home as the central topic. Some prisoners collapsed into apathy, lying in their huts, waiting for death. Others hardened into a fierce will to endure, clinging to the belief that survival was a kind of defiance. Lieutenant George Foster told an interviewer in 1946, "You stopped thinking about freedom. You thought only of the next bowl of rice. Yet inside you was a whisper, 'Live, outlast them, make them see that you could not be broken.'" By 1944, rumours of Allied progress seeped into the camp. Civilians whispered news of battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Guinea. Prisoners clung to each scrap of information. One evening, a smuggled radio briefly captured news of US landings at Leyte in October 1944. Word spread like fire. Though punishable by death, prisoners passed it from hut to hut, and men lay awake smiling in the dark, their stomachs empty but their hope rekindled. Yet hope was double-edged. Guards, aware that the war was turning, grew more brutal. Orders circulated that in the event of an American landing, prisoners were to be executed rather than liberated. This knowledge haunted the captives. Even amid brutality, there were moments of revelation. Some guards, themselves weakened, seemed shaken by the sight of skeletal prisoners who still clung to life. A post-war Japanese testimony reads, "I did not believe a man could live at 80 pounds. They looked like ghosts. Some of us feared that their spirits would curse us. We avoided their eyes." The recognition did not stop the starvation, but it marked the beginning of a crack in the illusion of superiority that Japanese soldiers had been taught. By the close of 1944, Cabanatuan was a camp of shadows. The once robust men of Bataan had been reduced to scarecrows weighing less than 100 pounds. Yet within the skeletal ranks burned a stubborn ember. They were still alive. Outside the wire, the thunder of war was approaching. The US invasion of the Philippines had begun. American planes roared overhead, sometimes bombing Japanese positions perilously close to the camps. Prisoners whispered that rescue might be near, though they also feared massacre. The guards, increasingly desperate, tightened discipline. Food grew scarcer still. Starvation reached its nadir. And so, as liberation loomed, the men of Cabanatuan found themselves more emaciated than ever, clinging to life by the slimmest of threads. In the next chapter, that tension would explode. Rumours of return became reality. The prisoners would soon be confronted not with another day of hunger, but with the shock of liberation, and the world would see, in their skeletal frames, the proof of starvation that words could barely capture. April 1945. As American forces advanced deeper into the Philippines, prison compounds like Cabanatuan and Bilibid were liberated one by one. What US soldiers encountered inside these bamboo stockades was almost beyond comprehension. The skeletal figures that stumbled toward them did not resemble the robust men who had been captured 3 years before. These were survivors reduced to shadows, skins stretched taut across protruding bones, eyes sunken, bodies weighing less than 100 pounds. For many of the Japanese guards, the moment was just as shocking. They had seen these prisoners every day, had beaten them for failing to carry out impossible labour, had driven them with rifle butts and bayonets. But because the decline was gradual, many never grasped just how much the men had wasted away. When liberation came suddenly, and the contrast between Allied liberators and emaciated POWs was visible side by side, the guards themselves reportedly recoiled. Accounts gathered after the war, through interrogations and published memoirs, confirm this astonishment. Some guards confessed that they had assumed the prisoners' frailty was exaggerated, the result of malingering. They had believed the American giants could withstand deprivation in ways Japanese soldiers could not. Instead, the reality was unavoidable. Men who once weighed 170 pounds now weighed 90. Filipinos, who had been strong farmers, stood at barely 80. Liberated soldiers later recalled the look on their captors' faces. Lieutenant John Cooksey, freed at Bilibid, remembered Japanese guards falling silent as emaciated men were carried out on stretchers. "They looked as if they finally understood what they had done," he said in a 1946 debriefing. For the prisoners, this moment of recognition was strangely hollow. Shock did not erase years of cruelty. Food withheld, medicine denied, punishments inflicted, all could not be undone by a look of horror. Yet the reversal of power was absolute. Within days, the same guards who had once lorded over skeletal prisoners were themselves prisoners of American troops. At Cabanatuan, where Rangers liberated over 500 men in January 1945, survivors recalled the guards' reaction when they first realized American rescue forces had arrived. "They were frozen in place," survivor Ralph Hibbs recalled. "Not because of the Rangers, but because they were confronted by what we looked like. They had never really seen us. American medical personnel who entered the camps carefully recorded weight, blood pressure, and symptoms. Their reports confirmed what the eyes already told. Dozens of men weighed between 85 and 100 pounds. Diseases like beriberi, pellagra, and dysentery had ravaged bodies. Doctors noted that even when given food, some men could not digest it at first. Their stomachs had shrunk too drastically. The Japanese guards, confronted with this evidence, were stunned. Some claimed ignorance. Others insisted they too had been starving, though US interrogators noted that while Japanese rations were limited, they had been sufficient to sustain far greater weight. The discrepancy spoke volumes about deliberate neglect. For Allied liberators, the image of skeletal men became one of the most powerful propaganda weapons of the Pacific War. Photographs taken in April and May 1945 circulated worldwide. They did not simply show victory, they showed the cost of captivity under Imperial Japan. The pictures of men with hollow cheeks and bodies scarcely more than bones spoke louder than testimony could. In the end, the guards' shock mattered little. What mattered was survival and the proof of what these men endured. The sight of POWs under 100 pounds was not merely a testament to starvation. It was evidence of a system designed to break the human body and spirit, and the resilience of those who, against all odds, endured it. The liberation of the Philippines in 1945 brought not only the triumph of Allied arms, but also the urgent humanitarian crisis of thousands of emaciated prisoners of war. When American troops entered prison camps such as Bilibid, Cabanatuan, and Puerto Princesa's few surviving sites, they faced a medical emergency unparalleled in scale. The men they found were alive, but barely, reduced to half their original body weight, ravaged by disease and psychologically scarred by 3 years of deprivation. The first task of the liberators was often triage. At Cabanatuan, where the 6th Ranger Battalion freed 513 prisoners in January 1945, Army medics carried lightweight stretchers improvised from bamboo and blankets. They moved methodically through the barracks, checking for vital signs, sorting the men into groups by severity of illness. Some were so weak they could not raise their heads. Others begged for food, though doctors quickly cautioned restraint. Captain James Fisher, a US Army surgeon attached to the Rangers, recalled in his medical debrief, "The men were starved nearly to death. It was imperative not to give them full rations immediately. We began with broth, thin rice gruel, and vitamin supplements. Their bodies could not have tolerated meat or bread." His records, preserved in the US National Archives, show average prisoner weights of 95 pounds, some as low as 78. The psychological impact on rescuers was immense. Many had prepared for combat, but not for the sight of fellow Americans reduced to skeletons. Ranger medic Rudy Cabigas, himself a Filipino volunteer, later wrote, "We were hardened soldiers, but when we carried those men out, many of us wept openly. We realized the fight had not only been against the Japanese army, it had been against starvation, against cruelty." The logistical challenge of evacuation compounded the crisis. In Luzon, rangers and guerrillas had to carry prisoners 30 miles through jungle terrain at night to reach Allied lines. Many collapsed en route. Filipino civilians, long sympathetic to the suffering POWs, provided carabao carts, blankets, and coconut water along the trail. Survivors later credited these villagers with saving their lives as much as the rangers themselves. At Bilibid prison in Manila, liberation came in February 1945. Here, over 800 prisoners were discovered. Some were already too far gone to be saved. Army records indicate that within the first 2 weeks of liberation, 84 men died despite medical intervention. Their organs had simply failed after years of malnutrition. But for the majority, careful treatment began to reverse the decline. Doctors employed a strict regimen. The first 48 hours focused on hydration, boiled water with electrolytes, coconut milk when available, and weak broth. Then came controlled calories, powdered milk, oatmeal, rice porridge, and fruit juices. Vitamin deficiencies had caused beriberi, from lack of thiamine, pellagra, from lack of niacin, and scurvy, from lack of vitamin C. Supplies of Red Cross vitamin tablets, finally reaching the Philippines, were administered daily. Within a week, many men reported reduced neuropathy and lessened edema. The medical staff also confronted rampant tropical diseases. Malaria, dysentery, and hookworm had weakened already fragile bodies. Quinine, atabrine, and sulfur drugs were dispensed as available. For men with advanced malaria, temperatures fluctuated dangerously, and several succumbed despite care. But the majority stabilized under disciplined treatment. Survivors' accounts reveal how liberation felt at the most basic human level. Sergeant Frank Bigelow recalled being given his first slice of white bread in 3 years. "I cried as I chewed it," he told an interviewer at the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion. "It tasted like home, like freedom." Others remembered bananas handed out by Filipino civilians, their sweetness almost overwhelming to mouths unused to sugar. American war correspondents soon arrived, documenting the emaciated survivors. Photographs of skeletal men eating carefully measured rations appeared in newspapers by March 1945, shocking the American public. The images galvanized support for the Pacific Campaign and erased lingering doubts about the ferocity with which the war was prosecuted. The sight of soldiers weighing under 100 pounds, some unable to stand even when freed, became proof of Japan's brutality. For the former prisoners, recovery was uneven. Many regained weight quickly once aboard hospital ships bound for Leyte or Guam. Others remained fragile, plagued by digestive issues, recurring malaria, or permanent damage to muscles and nerves. Doctors reported that some men could gain 20 pounds in a month, while others struggled for a year to break 120 pounds. Psychological wounds were equally severe. Nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt haunted liberated POWs. One man confessed in a 1946 oral history, "When the Rangers came, I thought I was dreaming, but in my dreams I never weighed 90 pounds. Another survivor noted that he could not stop hiding food under his mattress, even aboard a hospital ship. Years of deprivation had hardwired fear into the mind. For the Japanese guards, now prisoners themselves, the medical crisis was damning evidence. Allied interrogators confronted them with the statistics, Americans averaging under 100 pounds, Filipinos even less. Many guards deflected blame, claiming shortages affected all. But captured supply records told another story. Rations existed. They had simply been diverted to Japanese units. The deliberate policy of neglect was undeniable. By April 1945, US Army doctors estimated that without liberation, 80% of the surviving POWs would have perished within 6 months. Their calculations, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, highlighted the fragility of those saved. Liberation had come not a moment too soon. The medical response to POW liberation became a model for handling mass starvation in later conflicts. Controlled feeding protocols, strict hydration management, and psychological support were later applied in Europe when Allied troops liberated Nazi concentration camps. The experiences of Bataan and Cabanatuan shaped doctrine on how to save men who had been reduced to skeletal survivors. For the prisoners, though, liberation was not just about survival. It was about reclaiming identity. To weigh 90 pounds in April 1945 was to be reduced, diminished, almost erased. To step aboard a hospital ship, to see one's reflection fill out, to feel strength return. These were acts of defiance against the years of cruelty. Each pound gained was proof that they had endured, and that the guards' contempt had not destroyed them. The photographs of emaciated men shocked the world. But to the survivors, the greater shock was in living again, in realizing that despite weighing less than 100 pounds, despite being broken in body, they had not been broken in spirit. By mid-1945, the skeletal survivors of Japanese prison camps were leaving the Philippines aboard hospital ships. For many, the voyage across the Pacific was the first time in years they had eaten regular meals, slept in clean sheets, and been addressed with dignity. The transition from captivity to freedom was not simply physical. It was psychological, emotional, and deeply unsettling. On ships such as the USS Relief and USS Sanctuary, doctors maintained careful control of diets. Former POWs were still restricted to measured portions of milk, broth, and soft bread. Yet even with restrictions, the difference was dramatic. Some gained 10 pounds within a week at sea. The sound of waves, the smell of coffee from Navy galleys, and the gentle firmness of clean mattresses struck many as overwhelming luxuries. Letters written during the voyage reveal both gratitude and unease. Corporal Charles Page wrote in a note to his family, preserved by the National World War II Museum, "I weigh 101 pounds today. The doctors say I should be 165. They promise me I'll get there. It feels strange to hold a pen again, to write to you without a guard looking over my shoulder." His words captured the disorientation of men relearning how to live. Arrival on American soil was often met with jubilation. In San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, crowds gathered to greet returning prisoners. Newsreels captured gaunt men, some leaning on crutches, being wheeled down gangplanks to thunderous applause. Yet behind the cheers was a sobering truth. Many families did not recognize their sons, brothers, or husbands at first sight. One mother, meeting her son at Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco, reportedly fainted when she saw his frail frame. He weighed 94 pounds. Before the war, he had been a college football player over 200. Such scenes repeated across the country. The emotional reunions were filled with both joy and shock, underscoring the hidden costs of captivity. Doctors at stateside hospitals continued the careful regimen of recovery. Dietitians designed high-calorie, vitamin-rich plans to rebuild muscle. Psychologists, still in the early days of understanding post-traumatic stress, counseled men who suffered nightmares and anxiety. Many former POWs described a lingering compulsion to hoard food, hiding biscuits under pillows or stuffing fruit in pockets. It took months, sometimes years, to shed the habits ingrained by starvation. Testimonies began almost immediately. Military debriefing teams visited hospitals to collect first-hand accounts. The U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's office compiled statements to be used in war crimes trials. Men described beatings, denial of medicine, and the deliberate withholding of food. These testimonies, corroborated by captured Japanese records, would later serve as key evidence in the Manila war crimes trials of 1946. One survivor, Sergeant Albert Brown, testified, We lived on a handful of rice a day. I weighed 90 pounds when the Rangers carried me out. The guards laughed when we collapsed. Now they can answer to the world for what they did. His statement was entered into trial records preserved by the National Archives. Japanese officers and guards faced tribunals in Manila, Tokyo, and Yokohama. Photographs of liberated POWs, their bones showing through ragged skin, were displayed in court. The visual evidence needed little explanation. Several guards admitted under interrogation that they had been shocked by the prisoners' condition when liberation came, but the tribunals rejected ignorance as an excuse. Sentences ranged from prison terms to executions. For the survivors, public testimony was both a duty and a burden. Some spoke readily, determined to expose the cruelty of the camps. Others struggled, fearing their stories would not be believed or dreading the pain of reliving trauma. At veterans' reunions decades later, men admitted that silence had been easier for years, until history demanded otherwise. Back in their hometowns, the adjustment to normal life proved uneven. Some men regained full health, returning to work or studies within months. Others remained frail, unable to regain weight or stamina. Emotional scars often lingered longer. Families spoke of men who startled at sudden noises, who woke screaming at night, who sat silently at dinner tables even when food was plentiful. Despite the hardship, a common thread ran through many survivor testimonies, a determination to live fully, to reclaim the years taken. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, former POWs stood together, healthy and greying, recalling the moment of liberation when they had weighed under 100 pounds. One veteran said, "We were walking ghosts in 1945, but we came back. That was our victory." Historians today view these testimonies as essential windows into the experience of captivity. They provide not just data, weights, disease statistics, rations, but human voices that convey what numbers cannot. They remind us that the story of POWs in the Philippines is not only about suffering, but about resilience, survival, and the will to bear witness. By the time the war ended, the image of skeletal POWs had become part of the American consciousness. Newspapers, documentaries, and war crimes trials etched the reality into collective memory. The shock of the Japanese guards at liberation was mirrored by the shock of the world, and it cemented the narrative of Allied prisoners as both victims and survivors of a brutal system. For the men themselves, testimony was not just about condemning the past. It was about reclaiming identity. They were no longer anonymous skeletons weighed in hospital wards. They were fathers, brothers, workers, citizens, men who had endured the unimaginable and returned to tell the story. The liberation of the Philippines in 1945 and the sight of emaciated prisoners stumbling out of Japanese camps did more than shock Allied soldiers. It left an imprint on global memory that endures to this day. The men who weighed less than 100 pounds became symbols, their fragile bodies testifying to the cruelty of captivity and the resilience of the human will. But their story did not end with liberation. It continued through trials, remembrance, reconciliation, and education, shaping how the world came to understand the Pacific War. The Manila War Crimes trials in 1946 brought many Japanese officers and guards to account. Evidence included U.S. Army medical records showing average POW weights under 100 pounds, corroborated by photographs and testimony. Survivors stood in courtrooms, their thin frames still visible beneath uniforms issued after liberation, and described the deliberate withholding of food, the brutality of marches, and the contempt with which guards treated surrendering men. Several guards admitted that they had been shocked when liberation revealed the skeletal condition of the POWs. Yet tribunals rejected the argument that starvation was unavoidable. Captured records revealed that Japanese garrisons had received ample rice shipments. The shortage was not of food but of will to share it with captives. Sentences were handed down. Some guards received imprisonment, while command-level officers were executed. For survivors, justice felt incomplete, but it was an acknowledgement that the world had seen and condemned what had been done. In the decades after the war, liberated POWs faced the challenge of rebuilding lives. Some reintegrated smoothly, gaining back lost weight, starting families and returning to work. Others struggled with chronic illness, digestive disorders, and the invisible wounds of trauma. Malnutrition had left permanent scars, brittle bones, weakened hearts, and recurring neurological symptoms. Survivors' advocacy groups began to form in the 1950s, pressing the US government for recognition and medical support. Their testimonies were published in memoirs and oral history projects. At reunions, men compared notes, how much they had weighed at liberation, how long it took to recover, who among their friends had not survived. These gatherings became not only acts of remembrance, but acts of defiance, a statement that they had outlived the system that tried to destroy them. One symbolic act of memory was the dedication of the Bataan Corregidor Memorial in New Mexico in 1964, honouring the men of the 200th and 515th Coast Artillery who endured the death march. Emaciated figures carved in bronze stood as permanent witnesses to suffering. Similar monuments appeared across the United States, in California, Texas, and Illinois, often placed near veterans' cemeteries. They bore inscriptions reminding new generations that American and Filipino soldiers had endured captivity where survival itself was victory. The stories of POWs under 100 pounds also shaped post-war military and medical doctrine. US Army medical officers published detailed reports on refeeding syndrome, the dangerous condition that arises when starved individuals consume too much too quickly. These lessons were applied not only in Europe after the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, but also in later humanitarian crises worldwide. The controlled feeding protocols, broth, rice gruel, gradual caloric increases, became standard practice. In schools and universities, the POW experience became part of Pacific War education. Films such as The Great Raid, 2005, dramatized the Cabanatuan rescue, bringing renewed attention to the sight of gaunt men being carried out of prison huts. Museums, including the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Museum in New Mexico, continue to display artifacts, photographs, and oral histories. Visitors are confronted with images of soldiers whose uniforms hung from skeleton-like bodies, stark reminders of what captivity meant. Post-war Japan faced its own reckoning. In 1962, a US-Japanese aviation history symposium included discussion of POW treatment, with Japanese veterans expressing regret for misunderstanding the needs of Western prisoners. Some former guards admitted they had underestimated the effects of starvation, believing Americans, as giants, could endure more than Japanese soldiers. Others confessed to willful neglect. By the 1980s, reconciliation efforts included joint veterans reunions in Hawaii. At one such event in 1985, a handful of Japanese veterans listened as American survivors described weighing less than 100 pounds at liberation. The moment was fraught with emotion. Some Japanese bowed deeply, offering apologies. While forgiveness was not universal, the exchange reflected a slow process of mutual recognition that both sides carried scars, though the POWs had borne the greatest. Weight itself became a symbol in survivor memory. Men often remembered not just their liberation, but the exact number recorded by army doctors. "I was 87 pounds the day they weighed me," one survivor told a historian in 1990. "I never forgot that number. It was like a scar carved in me." Another recalled proudly that by Christmas 1945 he had reached 140 pounds, calling it "my personal victory over Japan." These numbers circulated in memoirs, documentaries, and veterans' speeches. They conveyed the cost of captivity more vividly than statistics of casualties. To say a soldier weighed 90 pounds at 6 feet tall told the story instantly, without need for elaboration. It was both evidence and memorial. In the Philippines, memory of the POWs remains intertwined with the broader suffering of civilians. Memorial crosses mark the route of the Bataan Death March, with annual ceremonies drawing American and Filipino veterans, diplomats, and schoolchildren. Survivors often remarked that Filipino civilians had saved them as much as any Allied soldier, passing rice balls through fences, offering water during marches, hiding escapees in villages. These acts are remembered as part of the shared legacy of endurance. By the late 20th century, fewer survivors remained, but their testimonies had been preserved. Books, archives, and documentaries ensured that the image of skeletal men weighing less than 100 pounds would not fade into obscurity. Their shock to Japanese guards at liberation became a shock to the world, galvanizing a collective vow: such cruelty must never be repeated. The legacy of these POWs is not only one of suffering but of resilience. They endured starvation, disease, and humiliation, and yet they lived to tell their story. In courtrooms, classrooms, and memorial parks, their voices continue to bear witness. They remind us that war is measured not only in battles won and territories gained, but in the lives of individuals, men who once weighed less than 100 pounds, but whose spirit proved immeasurable.